The most important thing about a poem, perhaps in terms of the kind of text it is and the effect it has on the reader, is that it slows you down. It's a device for making you attend more closely to language, but then also to everything that flows in and out of language.
Hi, Charlie.
Hello.
Thank you for being here with me today for our podcast, which is on Rilke, our set text this year. And you are a Rilke specialist. How did that happen?
Well, it's hard to say exactly, but I've always been interested in poetry. So from a long time ago, further than I can think, really. So that's the basic reason that if you enter in poetry and you end up doing German, then you end up with Rilke at some point, for sure.
Do you remember a specific moment that made you realize this is a form of text that you really like?
I do remember sort of in my O-level classes in English, actually going through the Shakespeare play. We had a really good teacher, and we went through it line by line in class, and it was very intense. We actually had drawing pins in the floor, the table had to be aligned with. And when we first went to the room, we had to make sure our tables are lined up with the drawing pins. He was very rigid like this, and nobody really liked him very much. But he was an excellent teacher of Shakespeare, and he would take you through, and he would really give you this intense kind of reading of each line and make you follow the way the language kind of unfolded. And I think that did definitely have an effect on me. And I think I was already somewhere in that zone, but not quite in the same way. So that definitely taught me how to focus on poetic language, I think, and gave me a sense of how much there was there to enjoy and to kind of feel sucked into. And then also, I think also at school, the other thing that sort of strengthened my interest in poetry was doing Latin, actually, as well. Because there we did look at poems, and because it was in Latin, you had to look at them very carefully and slowly. I think the slowness is important. And so I learned a lot about poetry from that, I think, as well, and about language and how language sort of assembles itself and words talk to other words within a poem. So I think both those things at school did play a big role.
You mentioned focus, attention, being careful in reading and following or discovering really how language unfolds. Why is that important for poetry in particular?
Well, I mean, I think that in the end, the most important thing about a poem, perhaps in terms of the kind of text it is and the effect it has on the reader, is that it slows you down. Mm-hmm. I mean, that in a way, you can think of all poetic devices as ways of slowing you down as a reader, so you don't kind of skate over it as you can over a page of prose, but you keep having to stop and kind of look back and anticipate and kind of think about how the words are connected and relish also the sounds and textures, not just the meaning or the kind of lexical meaning of the words. And so that's what it is really. It's a form of attention, to use a kind of slight pun for what a poem is. It makes you attend. It's a device for making you attend more closely to language, but then also to everything that flows in and out of language more closely than you would with any other form, I think. Mm-hmm. So, I think, poetry is the art of attention in many ways, I would say.
And how does this play a role for Rilke in particular?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, so if we're thinking about the Neue Gedichte, then that's particularly relevant here, I think, because the thing about the Neue Gedichte that sets them apart from the poems that Rilke wrote before then is precisely there's all sorts of ways he builds into his poems to slow you down as a reader, to get in your way even. So I think of the Neue Gedichte as being actually quite difficult to read, not because they're sort of ontologically difficult, or it's not that they're dealing with ungraspable ideas or kind of philosophical truths of a kind that's hard to dig into, but more that they just have lots of obstacles. They get in the way, and so you read and you come across the grammar is quite complicated, the syntax is often very complicated. So you really have to, again, pay attention in order to see what's going on. And up until that point, Rilke didn't write like that, by and large. He wrote in a much more kind of intuitive, sort of song-like, kind of flowing way. And for him, that was a bit of a problem. He came to see it as a problem. He thought that I mean, it's a long story, but which we can obviously go into. But
yes, please. I wanted to know what happened in his life at this point.
Well, I mean, it depends how far we go back, but I suppose that, well, let's say from a biographical point of view, when he wrote the Stundenbuch, which was the main collection before the Neue Gedichte, really, that's in 3 different books, and each book was written, they're quite long books, and they were written in a space of a week each time, and it was just a week of kind of mad writing, which he had no real control of, it seems, or at least he told us he had no much control of it, and he certainly was writing very fast without revising much. And he didn't feel he had any control about when those moments came along. So he would kind of hang around waiting for inspiration. Then suddenly it would come. He'd write a whole book of poems, or a book within a book. And then he'd hang around for a bit longer until that happened again. And he didn't think that was really how an artist should be functioning. And the main thing that made him think that was his encounter with visual arts, which began around about 1900 when he lived in an artist colony for a while and wrote a book about the painters there. But more particularly, it began when he went to Paris in 1902 to write a book on the sculptor Rodin.
With whom he worked.
Yeah, I mean, he went there initially to write a book on him, and he kind of more or less lived with him or very close to him. And then later on, there was a period when he worked as his secretary, so-called secretary. He was basically doing his correspondence. But that was actually a later period. The initial period, he was there to write a book on him. And so, as sometimes happens, Rodin gave him kind of full access to his life, really. And he kind of lived with him. He had his meals with him. He kind of watched him work. He kind of watched him sleep. He was around all the time, really, or pretty much. And what struck him about Rodin is that he wasn't dependent on these moments of inspiration. He just kind of he got up in the morning and went to work.
As a sculptor?
Yeah, as a sculptor. He went to his studio and started tapping away, or whatever the medium was he was working on at the time. And Rilke looked at that, and he was above all very conscious that Rodin knew his material incredibly well. So he knew marble, he knew clay, and he knew exactly what he could and couldn't do with it. And looking at that, Rilke thought to himself that, what's my material? It seems an odd question to ask, but he asked it very earnestly at that point. He almost as if he didn't know the answer. And of course, the answer is language, his words. But it's almost as if he only realised that then. Before, he was just like a sort of channel for words, which he thought of as, in some ways, a sort of a musical thing, perhaps in some ways, kind of just flowing through. But with the Neue Gedichte, he completely changed that attitude. He wanted to be more like a sculptor, and he wanted to know his material really well, i.e. language and words. He thought he needed to find out more about the poetic tradition, and he actually read the dictionary, things like that. And then he wanted to work in a way where he could just go and sit down and write a poem, have his subject. He might even sometimes work like a visual artist. He'd actually go out and do a poem in front of the object, like some of these poems which talk about animals in zoos, for example. It seems likely that, at least in part, these were done sort of on the spot, or at least some work was done on the spot. We don't know exactly. And of course, it is different writing a poem from painting a painting, but still, he was very influenced by that different way of working, because he wanted to get something more dependable that he could kind of hold on to, as opposed to this thing which he had no control over.
Right. So if I understand you correctly, the poetry was sort of at the beginning a flow within him that he let out sort of when it came, and then he put it into form inspired by a sculptor or visual artists.
Yeah, I mean, he changed his working methods, I would say, above all,
right.
Because he didn't want to become dependent on this inspiration, which he had no sense of what it was worth and where it had come from. It seemed not dependable. He didn't think that was the proper basis on which to be a poet. But in fact, it could later on, then he actually went back to being more dependent on inspiration, in fact. So it was the Neue Gedichte is quite a distinct phase when he's kind of working in a different way. And you can see that in the poems, I think.
How do we see that in the poems?
Well, because they feel much more constructed. If you read a Neues Gedicht, one of the Neue Gedichte, you have a feeling in most of them that a lot of work went into this, and there were probably lots of drafts. We don't have the drafts in most cases because he burnt them all, but my hunch is he burnt them all partly because there were so many of them, and he either just didn't want to, he had too much stuff, or he just didn't really want people to know that he'd worked on them so hard. I don't know. But in any case, they read like poems that have been worked upon. In the way you might work on a sculpture, kind of knocking away at it until you get exactly what you're looking for and correcting yourself and sort of changing your conception as you kind of work on the piece. And you can see that in the poems themselves because of this, as I was saying before, the way they don't have a sort of natural feel about them on the whole. And they're very kind of carefully constructed. They're often sonnets as well. He never wrote sonnets before then. He wrote one sonnet as when he was kind of a teenager.
And sonnet is a form of poetry that has a long tradition, right?
Yeah.
And he then uses that for
exactly. Yeah. So that's one of the ways in which he sort of tries to be more self-conscious about being a poet and more knowledgeable about the tradition he's working in, rather than using forms he's kind of made up himself, sort of free forms, which is what a lot of the Stundenbuch poems are like. In the Neue Gedichte, it's mostly the quatrain, or about a quarter of the poems are actually sonnets, and a lot of others are either nearly sonnets or just longer than sonnets. They're sort of still in dialogue with the sonnet form. And that's, I think, partly because he's wanting to enter into a tradition, and particularly actually a French tradition where the sonnet is much stronger than it is in German on the whole. And he was, of course, writing most of these poems in Paris, with kind of Baudelaire as an important sort of precursor.
What are the themes of the Neue Gedichte?
So themes, well, I mean, the thing that people always think of when you talk about the Neue Gedichte are poems about things.
Okay.
Now that, in a way, that's a little bit of a distraction because lots of the poems are not about things, but some of them are. So things things like a kind of piece of lace or a ball, though the ball in some ways is not a particularly good example because that poem is not so much about the ball, although it's called the ball, but it's about the flight of the ball. So it's about movement rather than the thing, perhaps, or about statues. Or about kind of, you get things within poems like also very sort of clearly there, like there's a very striking brush in a poem about a morgue, for example. So that is definitely a part of the Neue Gedichte. He's focusing on concrete objects, and again you can see this is sort of connected to sculpture in some ways. Sculpture generally, unless it's abstract, I suppose, has to attend to things in the world and do versions of them in some way. But there's also lots of poems about Paris, about people, different kinds of people, particularly people in Paris, and poems also to do with myth and to do with the Middle Ages. So there's a number of themes which can come back in both parts of the Neue Gedichte.
So there are some things like a ball that we might know how it looks like, so quite imaginative, where we can follow him in our own understanding of things, but then also themes like myths where we might not even know what he refers to, and then we have to find out through the poem.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think when he talks about mythical themes, then they're usually based on something quite concrete. So there's two famous poems to do with Apollo, but they're based on statues of Apollo. One is a real statue, one is perhaps an imagined one. It's not quite clear. So they normally have a sort of, a kind of concrete kind of origin. And that, I think, is something he's quite deliberately forcing himself to do in a bid to write poems of a more sort of dependable and kind of workmanlike kind of nature. As I was saying before, it's partly also reflected in the themes. But you can think a little bit about it as the collection is sometimes thought about as being a museum or kind of gallery that you can kind of walk around and look at the different exhibits, and it does feel a bit like that often. So you've got a sort of progression from the classical world with which each half starts, and then it goes on into sort of medieval, and then there's a bit of a leap, but there's lots of kind of 19th century sort of subjects as well, which would have been the recent past for Rilke that he's sort of some sense, quite nostalgic about. I think he's very conscious of sort of time passing quickly, as it were, or things changing quickly at the time he's writing.
When is that exactly?
Well, he went to Paris in 1902, and the very first poem written in the Neue Gedichte is generally thought to be Der Panther, which was written in 1902 probably, though we don't know for sure. But most of the poems were written in 1906, 1907 and 1908, and then a few in between.
So that's a time of social change.
Yeah, and it's certainly a time of change. I mean, above all, the growth of big cities, I think, and Paris was, the best known of these cities, which had kind of expanded hugely at the time. And it was really the first time Rilke really lived in a big city properly. He was in Berlin for a bit, but he was only on the edges and he wasn't really part of it. Whereas in Paris, he was there for years and kind of lived right in the middle. So that was he's partly processing that experience as well in the Neue Gedichte, and that's also partly why he's focusing on these kind of concrete, kind of tangible, sort of dependable forms in the poems, because they offer him some kind of, I think, sort of security against the sort of mass experience of Paris with kind of people rushing past. You get these pictures at the time taken with a camera where the shutters left open, and you just get a kind of blur. And I think that's the kind of way that Paris was experienced by Rilke and others at the time also, that there was more than you could take in, basically. You were left with a sort of blur. And these poems are a way of trying to sort of counter that in some ways, by focusing on discrete objects and sort of carving out moments of time from that blur.
So to this fast society that is much faster, all of a sudden he comes to with that form of writing that slows you down.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, that's very good. Yeah, precisely. So the slowing down is definitely part of that, and so you're made to dwell. I mean, that's also a feature of the collection that is distinct about the Neue Gedichte, in that the Stundenbuch, you sort of one poem leads on to the next, and you can read them very much as a kind of sequence, and it's sort of you read one, then you go on to the next, and you don't you're not held up very much. You're more kind of propelled forward with the collection. Whereas the Neue Gedichte, you're kind of made to dwell each time. And although there are themes, as I've suggested, it's really a collection of discrete poems more than most of Rilke's other collections. So, they're easily anthologizable because they don't necessarily have to have the other poems around them to kind of make sense. And so, yes, you stop, you dwell, you think, you relate, particularly past and present, I suppose, often in most of the poems. So you become conscious of time, but perhaps also time becomes something more manageable in some ways than it at least did sometimes for Rilke when he was, in Paris, confronting this new and slightly perturbing world. Sie saß so wie die anderen beim Tee. Mir war zuerst, als ob sie ihre Tasse ein wenig anders als die anderen fasse. Sie lächelte einmal. Es tat fast weh. Und als man schließlich sich erhob und sprach, und langsam, und wie es der Zufall brachte, durch viele Zimmer ging, man sprach und lachte, da sah ich sie. Sie ging den anderen nach, verhalten, so wie eine, welche gleich wird singen müssen, und vor vielen Leuten. Auf ihren hellen Augen, die sich freuten, war Licht von außen wie auf einem Teich. Sie folgte langsam, und sie brauchte lang, als wäre etwas noch nicht überstiegen. Und doch, als ob nach einem Übergang sie nicht mehr gehen würde, sondern fliegen.
Wow.
I think that's one of the nice ones in there, but there's loads of great poems. I mean, it's a wonderful collection.
It feels like we have with Rilke a really careful observer.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah,
with a lot of.
Yeah.
I don't want to read this into him, but empathy, especially. With
Oh
this
yeah,
one.
I think that's definitely true. Definitely. Yeah. I know that's what he is really, is a very sensitive observer, particularly in the Neue Gedichte. But then he manages to change that into render that in language in a way which is really quite unusually sort of complex and sensitive as well. And then in such a way that what you're perceiving then sort of, not so much in this poem, maybe that remains quite concrete, I think, though there's this sort of transformation into a bird at the end. But generally, the more he looks, the more complex the process of looking becomes. And these things seem to kind of, as you try and hold on to them, they also seem to dissolve. Which is, I think he's trying to write about the experience of perception in some ways.